Hello, my darlings. Mother Raven here with another wonderful Folklore Thursday. Today I am bringing you some Japanese mythology from the book Japanese Fairy World by William Elliot Griffis. First, I will start with the creation of heaven and earth. Of old, the heavens and earth were not separated. Land and water, solids and gases, fire and stone, light and darkness were mixed together. All was liquid and turbid chaos. Then the mighty mass began to move from within. The lighter particles of gas and air began to rise, forming the sky and heavens. The heavy parts sank and cohered, becoming the earth. The water formed the four seas. Then there appeared something like a white cloud, floating between heaven and earth. Out of this came forth three beings: the being of the middle heaven, the high august being, and the majestic being. These three hid their bodies. Out of the warm mold of the earth, something like a rush sprouted up. It was clear and bright like crystal. From this rush spout came forth a being whose title is the Delightful and Honorable Rush Sprout. Next appeared another being out of the buds of the rush sprouts, whose name is the Honorable Heaven Born. These five beings are called the Heavenly Gods. Next came into existence four pairs of being. First, the being sprung from the first mud and the being of sand and mud. 2, the being with hands and feet growing, and the being having breath. 3, the male being and the female being of the great place, the earth. 4, the being of complete perfection, and the being who cries out, strange and awful, to her mate. Charming. Thus, the last pair that came into existence were the first man and the first woman, called Izanagi and Izanami. It is said that other pairs of beings before Izanagi and Izanami were only their imperfect forms, or the processes through which they passed before arriving at perfection. These two beings lived in the heavens. The world was not yet formed, and the soil floated about like a fish in the water, but near the surface, and was called the floating region. The sun, earth, and moon were still attached to each other like a head to a neck, or arms to a body. They were little by little separating, the parts joining them growing thinner and thinner. This part, like an isthmus, was called Heaven's Floating Bridge. It was on this bridge that Izanagi and Izanami were standing when they saw a pair of wagtails cooing and billing sweetly together. The heavenly couple were so delighted with the sight that they began to imitate the birds. Thus began the art of love, which mortals have practiced to this day. While talking together on this bridge of heaven, they began to wonder if there was a world beneath them. They looked far down upon the green sea, but could see nothing. Then Izanagi took his long jeweled spear and plunged it into the turbid mass, turning it round and round. As he lifted it up, the drops which trickled from it hardened into earth of their own accord, and thus dry land was formed. And Izanagi was cleansing his spear. The lumps of muck and mud which had adhered to it flew off into space and were changed into stars and comets. It is said that by turning his spear round and round, Izanagi set the earth revolving in daily revolutions. To the land thus formed they gave the name, the Island of the Congealed Drop. because they intended to create a large archipelago and wished to distinguish this as the first island. They descended from heaven on the floating bridge and landed on the island. Izanagi struck his tall spear in the ground, making it the axis of the world. He then proceeded to build a palace around the spear, which formed the central pillar. This spot was formerly at the North Pole, but is now at Ishima off the central east coast of Japan. They then resolved to walk around the island and examine it. This done, they met together. Izanami cried out, "What a lovely man!" But Izanagi rebuked her for speaking first, and said they must try it again. Then they walked around the island once more. When they met, Izanami held her tongue, while Izanagi said, "What a lovely woman!" Being now both in good humor, they began the work of creating Japan. The first island brought up out of the water was Awaji, and then the main island. After that, 8 large islands were created, whence comes one of the names of Japan, the Empire of the 8 Great Islands. 6 smaller islands were also produced. The several thousand islets which make up the archipelago of the everlasting Great Japan were formed by the spontaneous consolidation of the foam of the sea. After the country was thus formed, the divine pair created 8 million of earthly gods or kami, and 10,000 different things on the earth. Vegetation sprang up over all the land, which was, however, still covered with mist. So Izanagi created with his breath the 2 gods, male and female, of the wind. All of these islands are the children of Izanagi and Izanami, and, when first born, were small and feeble, but gradually grew larger and larger, attaining their present size, like human beings, which are at first tiny infants. As the gradual separation of the land and sea went on, foreign countries were formed by the congealing of the foam of the sea. The god of fire was then born of Izanami, his mother. This god often got very angry at anyone who used unclean fire. Izanami then created by herself the gods of metal, of clay, and of fresh water. This latter was told always to keep the gods of fire quiet, to put him out when he began to do mischief. Izanagi and Izanami, though married but a short time, began to quarrel, for Izanami had once told her husband not to look at her when she hid herself. But Izanagi did not do what she requested, but intruded on her privacy when she was unwell, and stared at her when she wished to be alone. Izanami then got very angry and went down to the lower world of darkness and disappeared. In the dark world under the earth, Izanami stayed a long time, and after long waiting, Izanagi went after her. In the darkness of the underworld, he was horrified at what he saw, and leaving his consort below, tried to escape to the earth again. In his struggles, several gods were created, one of them coming up out of his staff. When he got up to daylight, he secured a large rock to close up the hole in the earth. Turning this rock into a god, he commanded him to watch the place. He then rushed into the sea and continued washing for a long time to purify himself. In blowing out from his lungs the polluted air inhaled in the underworld, the 2 evil gods sprang forth from his breath, as these would create great harm and wickedness. Izanagi created 2 other gods to correct their evil. But when he had washed his eyes, he could see clearly again. There sprang out 2 precious and lovely beings, one from his left eye, being a rare and glistening maiden, whom he afterwards named Amaterasu, or the heaven illuminating spirit. From his right eye appeared Susanoo, the ruler of the moon, now being pure again and having these lovely children, Izanagi rejoiced and said, "I have begotten child upon child, and at the end of my begetting I have begotten me 2 jewel children." Now the brightness of the person of the maiden Amaterasu was beautiful and shone through heaven and earth. Izanagi was well pleased and said, "Though my children are many, none of them is like this wonder child. She must not be kept in this region." So taking off the necklace of precious stones from his neck and rattling it, he gave it to her, saying, "Rule thou over the high plain of heaven." At that time the distance between heaven and earth was not so very great, and he sent her up into the blue sky by the heaven-uniting pillar on which the heavens rested like a prop. She easily mounted it and lived in the sun, illuminating the whole heavens and earth. The sun, now gradually separated from the earth, are both moved farther and farther apart until they rested where they are now. Izanagi next spoke to Susanoo, the ruler of the sea, and said, "Rule thou over the newborn earth and the blue waste of the sea, with its multitudinous salt waters." So then the heavens and the earth and moon were created and inhabited. And as Japan lay directly opposite the sun, when it's separated from the earth, it is plain that Japan lies on the summit of the globe. It is easily seen that all other countries were formed by the spontaneous consolidation of sea foam and the collection of mud in various seas. The stars were made to guide warriors from foreign countries to the court of the Mikado, who is the true son of heaven. How the sun goddess was enticed out of her cave. When the far-shining goddess, on account of the evil pranks of her brother Susanoo, the ruler of the moon, hid herself in a cave, there was no more light, and the heaven and the earth were plunged into darkness. A council of all gods was held in the dry bed of one of the rivers, which we call the Milky Way, in the fields of heaven. The question of how to appease the anger of a goddess was discussed. A long-headed and very wise god was ordered to think out a plan to entice her forth from the cave. After due deliberation, it was resolved that a looking-glass should be made to tempt her to gaze at herself, and that tricks should be played to arouse her curiosity to come out and see what was going on. So setting to work with a will, the gods forged and polished a mirror, wove cloth for beautiful garments, built a pavilion, carved a necklace of jewels, made wands, and tried an augury. All being ready, the fat and rosy-cheeked goddess of mirth, with face full of dimples and eyes full of fun, named Izumi, was selected to lead the dance. She had a flute made from a bamboo cane by piercing holes between the joints, while every god in the great orchestra had a pair of flat, hard wood clappers which he struck together. She bound up her long flowing sleeves with creeper vine, and made for herself a baton of twigs of bamboo grass, which she could direct the motion of the musicians. This she held in one hand, while the other was a spear wound round with grass on which small bells tinkled. Great bonfires were lit in front of the cave so that the audience of gods could see the dance. A large circular box, which resounded like a drum when trod on, was set up for Izumi to dance upon. The row of cocks now began to crow in concert. All being ready, the strong-handed god who was to pull the sun god out of the cave, as soon as overcome by her curiosity, she should peep forth, hid himself beside the stone door of the cave. Izumi mounted the box and began to dance. As the drum box resounded, the spirit of folly seized her. Izumi mounted the box and began to dance. As the drum box resounded, the spirit of folly seized her, and she began to chant a song. Still more foolish, Izumi waved her wand wildly, loosening her dress, and danced till she had not a stitch of clothing left on her. The gods were so amused at her foolishness that they all laughed, until the heavens shook, as with claps of thunder. The sun goddess within the cave heard all these strange noises, the crowing of the cocks, the hammering of the anvil, the chopping of wood, the music of the kodo, the clappering of the hardwood, the tinkling of bells, the shouting of Izumi, and the boisterous laughter of the gods. Wondering what it all meant, she peeped out. As she did so, the doubly beautiful goddess held up the mirror. The far-shining one, seeing her own face in it, was greatly astonished. Curiosity got the better of fear. She looked far out. Instantly the strong-handed god pulled the rocky door open and seized her hand, dragging her forth. Then all the heavens and earth were lightened. The trees and grass became green again, and the goddess of colors resumed her work of tinting the flowers. The gloom fled from all eyes, and human beings again became white-faced. Thus the calamity which had befallen heaven and earth by the sun goddess hiding in the cave became a means of much benefit to mortals. For their necessity, the gods were compelled to invent the arts of metalworking, weaving, carpentry, jeweling, and many other useful appliances for the human race. They also, on this occasion, first made use of music, dancing, the de kagura, the comedy which makes the gods laugh, and many of the games which children play at this present time. So quoth this raven.